Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has warned that South Africa will likely see a sovereign debt crisis by 2024 if the country's spending and economic outlook doesn't drastically change. In April, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a 500 billion rand economic support package to help the country amid the COVID-19 pandemic. That figure is around 10% of the country's annual GDP. The president explained that 130 billion rand will come from reprioritization of the budget. Now, the rest will be funded internally and externally, including approaching the World Bank, IMF, Development Bank, and others. For more on this, I'm joined now by independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good evening and thank you for your time tonight. The finance minister saying South Africa would have a sovereign debt crisis by 2024. Should we panic? Is that something that should concern us? What does it really mean?
Good evening and good evening to the viewers. Look, I think obviously what we do know is that South Africa has got the wrong way of dealing with public finances in that we spend much more than what we can raise in the form of income or revenue. Now, this has been a problem that's been going on for a couple of years, and of course, there are only two ways in which you can deal with that problem. It's either you're able to generate more money in the form of taxes or you simply borrow more money. The problem, of course, with borrowing more money is that you have to pay it back. And what we now know is that in the context of us having been downgraded into junk status, cost of borrowing for us is going to be much higher, which simply means that if we do go and borrow tomorrow, we're going to be charged interest rates that are much higher than we were being charged before. And the question here is, when you do borrow, why are you borrowing? And if you're borrowing in order just to pay old costs, in order to pay salaries, it means that actually you're not investing or you're not taking those borrowings and using them to generate extra income. So the problem with that is that we are going to get to a point where nobody wants to lend to us. And that, of course, is going to be the point in time that the finance minister refers to as a sovereign debt crisis, when we're simply unable to borrow money from normal traditional sources and somebody has to come and bail us out as a country.
Why is the minister calling for a zero-based budget?
So one of the key things that we know about public finances and public finance management is that what people do on an annual basis, as a department, for example, they will come and say to the finance minister, last year you gave us so much money and this is what we were able to do with it. This year we need to do a bit extra, so therefore, based on what you gave us last year, we are asking for an increase of XYZ. So that's really how normal budgeting processes works. And when that happens, we refer to it as baseline budgeting. So last year is then used as a baseline for negotiating what you want to get this year. The problem with that is that people then don't bother to then ask the question of, well, when you came here last year and you asked for those amounts of cash, the things that you were asking for, were they things that were necessary or were they things that were completely unavoidable? So when you don't ask that question, it simply means that on an annual basis, you're simply going to give the departments that additional extra that they ask for if the money is available. Under zero-based budgeting, however, it's actually a blank slate. So you start off by firstly having to explain every single line item that you put on your budget, and you have to explain why it's necessary, you have to explain why it's unavoidable, and you have to explain what role it plays in the bigger question of how the public financial wallet should essentially be managed. So zero-based budgeting then forces everyone to explain in detail why they're asking for the things that they're asking for, and then be put into this competing pot of priorities where you can get told, we understand that you love to buy flowers for your employees, but somebody else needs, hot machines, for example. So therefore, in the prioritization, you're not going to get your flowers. So under zero-based budgeting, you are able to interrogate every single request that is made, and you're able to then get people to understand why things can or cannot be done.
Is that the radical change that the economy needs, and that would help us avert this sovereign debt crisis?
No, absolutely not. The economy needs something far more fundamental than that. So what this process will do is that it will simply provide a basis for the minister knowing where to allocate the very limited resources that he has. So it's not going to generate additional money for the state. It simply says that in the context of competing priorities, everybody must submit a clean budget, a zero-based budget, and will reallocate resources based on whose budget makes the most sense. Now, obviously, every department is going to get a particular share, but not everybody is going to get what they hoped for. So you're really just redistributing the limited resources that you have. The economy needs something far more fundamental, because for the economy to be able to grow to an extent that we can now say in the future there's actually enough to be allocated to the departments that ask for it, you need to actually have a complete restructure of this economy. And the first question must be, what is it that we need to do in order for this economy to be bigger tomorrow, to be bigger the week after, and to be bigger the year after? And in most cases, government tends to struggle to identify exactly what are the things that will drive the economic growth and how do you actually leverage them and ensure that they do drive the economic growth in the shortest time frame possible.
It's going to be even more difficult with COVID-19 and a number of businesses having shut down, and just that recovery in itself is going to be a problem, never mind growing the economy.
Yes. Now remember, business activity is a proxy for tax collections, because businesses are by and large taxpayers in their own capacity, and also employers, which enable people to pay income tax. So when you can already see that businesses themselves are shutting down, it's impossible for tax collections to rise. So that's the big issue here. And for as long as the economic gridlock exists, and for as long as this transition back to at least the same scale or the same levels of economic activity that we had before the lockdown, when that gap is much longer, it simply means that the capacity of the state to actually even rely on tax revenues diminishes every single day. So every single day that the SARS commissioner cannot sell cigarettes formally and then actually levy a tax on that, it means that there's less money for him to be able to reallocate at the end of the year. So it really becomes a daily, pathway. It's a daily march towards this question of the sovereign crisis, because the more days you spend under lockdown, the more days when the economy isn't generating the type of income or the type of taxes it should be generating, then the closer you get to the question of saying, where do I get the next rand? And if I can't borrow it from the banks, do I go to the IMF? And what are the consequences of that?
And that's exactly where I wanted to come, because you are much better at reading code from Treasury than most of us. There is this $4.2 billion in emergency funding from the International Monetary Fund, should South Africa want it. Is this the minister preparing us to say, this is where we are, we're going to just have to go for this money, there's just no other way?
Look, the difficulty here is that you know how machonistas work. There's always going to be someone willing to lend you money, especially if you're a country that says, look, at the end of the day, I can always raise taxes if really push comes to shove. So there's always going to be a machonista there somewhere. The thing that we need to watch out for is if the government comes out and says we've been able to borrow an additional 10 rand, the question is, what is the cost of that borrowing? Because for them, if they say that give us a high interest rate, somebody will give them a high interest rate and they'll take the gamble. The key issue here is that when you do borrow, it has to be affordable. And the essence of what affordable means then obviously varies with every finance minister, with every treasury department that you speak to. So we do know that there's always going to be somebody out there willing to give you money. It's just a question of you cannot do so in a manner that condemns future generations to having to pay for the sins of where we are today. So that's the issue that we need to be able to remember. And when you do talk about the IMF emergency bailout, that was actually done by the IMF on the basis that the entire world said we've got a health crisis that we cannot individually as countries afford to deal with. So therefore, the IMF had to tap in and say, actually, you, South Africa, being a contributing member of the IMF, you've got access to a facility of $4.2 billion. What was quite important about that particular conversation is that the IMF then said the traditional conditions that we generally impose on people who borrow from us are not going to be on the same level because we are dealing with a specific healthcare crisis. Now, South Africa then wants to go back and says, in addition to the 4.2 billion that we've asked for to deal with the health pandemic, we now need another billion or another 10 billion to deal with the general economic conditions. Then the terms and conditions of that particular financing are going to be very different to what we've seen with the 4.2 billion. The problem with the IMF's conditions is that we know, unfortunately, historically, they tend to be very, very problematic, particularly for developing nations. And for a country with the unemployment stats that we have, with a dead economy like ours, the IMF bailout will be a huge catastrophe, not just for this generation, but for future generations to come.